I've been writing about climate change since 2004, and I've been to almost every COP since then. COP's Conference of the Parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I've just come back from the most recent COP, COP26, which was in Glasgow, as you know. That's my 15th COP in 17 years. And really, it wasn't unusual in the response that it received. I came back from COP to find that pretty much everyone who had been there and everyone who'd observed the proceedings had decided that it was a failure. We were told in nearly every newspaper and every news bulletin, everywhere you looked, that COP26 had not set out to solve the planetary problem of climate change, that COP26 had failed in one way or another, or in the words of Greta Thunberg, that all that happened at COP26 was blah, blah, blah. So I've got a rather unfashionable view to present to you tonight. It's my view that COP26 was not a failure. In fact, it was a success. Not only was it a success, but actually those people who derided COP26 as a failure are not only mistaken, but actually dangerous, because what we need is a cold look at COP26 that sees where the successes were, what actually happened there, why we need to build on that to go forward. And in fact, if we don't see it as a success, then our chances of doing anything about climate change in the next crucial 10 years, in which, as we've already heard, we need to have global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 if we're going to stay within 1.5 degrees. If we don't see the successes at COP26, then we have no chance of reaching that. So what happened at COP26? Well, nations got together and there were, 120 world leaders, about 30,000 people in Glasgow, a bit more than that, taking part in the COP. And over the course of 2 weeks, these nearly 200 countries agreed to reduce greenhouse gases to something like, to quantities that would take us to roughly 2.4 degrees of heating above pre-industrial levels. That's according to the Climate Action Tracker. So that's a way off 1.5 degrees. But when you consider that going into COP26, when the UK took on the presidency of COP26, we were headed for more than 3 degrees of warming, then you can see that actually that's quite a substantial difference. Now, these don't sound like great quantities. You know, the difference between 1.5 degrees, 2.4 degrees doesn't sound like an awful lot. But when you consider that today we are only about 5 degrees warmer than we were in the last ice age, and that when the world was 5 degrees warmer than it is today, the poles were covered in swampy jungle, then you can see what a difference those apparently marginal differences in temperature make. So that's really worth having to bring down temperatures from something over, bring down the temperature estimate from something over 3 degrees to about 2.4. If all the promises that were made in Glasgow were met, we'd probably get to something like 1.8 degrees of warming, according to the International Energy Agency. Again, that's well over 1.5, but it's somewhere in the same ballpark. It's a heroic assumption to assume that all of the promises made in Glasgow will be kept, but still, it's taking us somewhere near to where we need to be. What else happened? Well, we got some agreement on a phase down of coal. Now, there was a great deal of debate about this, about what we should do on coal. And in the text that came out of Glasgow, instead of getting a reference to a phase out of coal, which is what most countries wanted, we got a phase down of coal instead. Now, this came about because China and India came along at the last minute in proceedings, literally as the gavel was about to be brought down on the agreement. They came along and said, we're not going to agree to a phase out of coal. This was portrayed as a show of strength by China and India, and a great show of weakness by the other countries, where the phase out of coal was watered down to a phase down instead. Actually, I think that's a wrong interpretation. I think we should see this instead as a show of weakness by China and India and a show of strength by the rest of the world. Because to go from a phase out to a phase down doesn't actually make all that much difference in practice. The point is that you've got a commitment in there to doing away with coal. It shows a very clear direction of travel. And let's consider what happened 10 years ago at a COP. In Durban in 2011, we were setting the scene for what became the Paris Agreement. And most countries in the world, the EU, the US, Japan, and most developing countries had formed a kind of loose coalition where they said that they would have a roadmap that would lead to more action on the climate. And that's what eventually became the Paris Agreement. That roadmap led to the Paris Agreement. But in that conference at Durban, there were two countries that held out, China and India, and they forced everyone to carry on negotiating late into the night on Friday night, late into Saturday night, and it seemed by the early hours of Sunday morning that China and India were going to win, that there would not be an agreement to create a roadmap to what eventually became the Paris Agreement. What happened there was that the EU stood up, said, no, we've got the moral authority here, we've got these developing countries behind us, we can do something here, we're not going to let you win. And China and India actually backed down, and we did get the roadmap that led to Paris. So if you contrast that with what happened in Glasgow, where their great show of strength was to stand up and say, no, you can't have a phase out, you can have a phase down. That's a completely different situation. And you can see how far things have progressed in that time, that those who tried to wreck agreement this time in Glasgow only managed to make a tiny change in one word, instead of being able to scupper the whole thing. So what that showed was the strength of the Paris Agreement, the strength of multilateral action on climate change. And think about this multilateral action. Look at the world around you. We're not seeing much multilateral action, are we? We're not seeing agreement on how to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. We're not seeing agreement on how to share vaccines. We're not seeing any kind of concerted international action on that. We're seeing different countries do different things, and we're seeing anti-vaccine people having a great deal of influence around the world. So we live in a very fragmented world. We're seeing China firing off missiles in the South China Sea. We're seeing the US and the UK and Australia making a defence pact. We're seeing a lack of concerted economic action as well in the wake of the pandemic. So we're not seeing multilateral action anywhere else on the globe. We are seeing it when it comes to the climate. And I think that's really important and something to be held on to. The point about seeing COP26 as a failure is that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's dangerous to see it as a failure for several reasons. One is that politicians run away from something that's tainted by failure. So if you keep saying COP26 was a failure, then politicians won't want to have anything to do with this in future. And we've got to carry on. What we agreed at COP26 was that nations would come back next year at COP27 and take that 2.4 degree temperature rise and bring it closer to something like 1.5 degrees. So we need them to come back. We need the politicians to come back. Scaring them off by calling what happened in Glasgow a failure is not going to help with that. Calling it a failure also discourages people around the world. If people see this big international process, this massive meeting about climate change, and they think, oh, well, nothing happened there, it was all blah, 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 then they've got very little motivation to come back. It really is a very fine line between climate success and climate failure, between climate doomism and climate positivity. It's really easy to tip people over into despair if they don't see some kind of success, something to hope for. And the other thing that you open the door to, if you see COP26 as a failure, is you open the door to techno-lunacy. A few days after the COP26 result, there was a piece in the Financial Times by a very eminent observer who said, well, COP26 was a failure, so what we need to do now is we need to geoengineer the climate, because having conducted this massive uncontrolled experiment with the climate, obviously what we need to remedy that is another massive uncontrolled experiment with the climate. But there are plenty of techno-loons out there who will tell you that that is the case, and there's nothing to stop them, because they don't need an international agreement to start sending up planes and start seeding clouds, or to start sending out ships, or to build, sending out ships to seed the seas with different forms of iron or whatever other compounds they think that they can find that will change the climate, or to start putting up reflectors in space. They don't need our permission to do that. They can just form these billionaires clubs and put together enough money and do it themselves. So if we start to talk about the multilateral process around the world of the UN as a failure, then that's what we're opening the door to. And that's a very dangerous future, and I don't think that that's one that we should be encouraging. So before you join the bandwagon to call COP26 a failure, that's what I'd like to just draw your attention to, the fact that an awful lot was achieved there. Not enough, of course, not enough. An awful lot needs still to be done. But in the next year, there will be another crucial climate meeting, and the year after that, and the year after that still. And when we get to a few years down the line, we could be looking into the barrel of a Donald Trump presidency in the US. We need to have a lot of climate success under our belts before we face that prospect, because otherwise he could turn back whatever progress we have made if we haven't made enough before then. So as we face that, we need to build on the success of COP26, stop just taking this negative attitude of seeing it merely in terms of what it didn't achieve, and look forward to what we can all do. Because the UN process is the only process in which all countries of the world participate as equals, in which the smallest state threatened by inundation, if 1.5 degrees, if we go over 1.5 degrees of warming, the smallest state has an equal say with the greatest, with the United States, with China, with India, with the UK, with Europe. And it's only when we have those small, vulnerable, poor countries sitting in the same room, eyeball to eyeball with the rich countries who are causing this problem. It's only when we do that that we actually achieve anything as a world. And that's what we need to keep doing. Thank you.